Don't, on the one hand, warble on about the importance of a free press, and then when a member of that free press says something you don't like, sign a letter demanding that they apologise or are sacked. Let me tell you a little bit what I think is going on here. I think, as I said to you a little earlier, this crisis is entirely self-inflicted. That every step of the way this week, the BBC has shot itself in the foot and fuelled this row. The decision to lead the 10 o'clock news show with a story about what one of the BBC's own presenters had tweeted about the government policy, rather than talk about that policy and the implications of it, was absolutely balmy. That was the BBC saying, of everything going on in this country at the moment, of all the consequences of what the government had just announced, what we think is the very most important story around is what our Match of the Day presenter thinks about it. It wasn't, it isn't. What was going on here was the BBC following where some newspapers had led. Yes, the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Express had the Lineker story on their front pages. But the BBC is supposed to set the agenda, not just follow what the right-wing newspapers are doing. That's why it gets so much of taxpayers' money. That has not happened this week. Secondly, the decision to take Gary Lineker off air, just as the story was starting to die down, made it so much worse. And I said during the week, I don't think a sports presenter should be removed from his job because of what he does or doesn't have to say on a separate social media account about a totally unrelated matter. It was a ludicrous decision. But I think why it happened is because those at the top of the BBC have become pretty terrified, frankly, of angering those in government. In some ways, that's not entirely surprising. We have had years of speculation about the future of the licence tree, months and months of threats from ministers about taking drastic action that would effectively end the current funding of the BBC. So the very future of that institution, in its current form, depends on the government's goodwill. No massive surprise then that its leadership might be concerned about losing that goodwill. But good journalism means standing up to those in power, regardless of who they are, and regardless of the consequences for you. That's what heroic journalists in countries far more autocratic than ours are doing every single day. And we're not talking about people being locked up or imprisoned or even assassinated. We're talking about having a funding model changed. And if that is enough, as I suspect it partly was, to cow those at the top of the BBC into caving to government pressure, well, I don't think it reflects particularly well on them. Have those running the BBC behaved not in the public interest this week, but in their own? Maybe. But we also have to look at the government role in all of this. We have to look at those who are exerting the pressure, not just bowing to it. And I would say this. To the MPs and peers, 26 of them at last count, who signed a letter to the BBC demanding that the organisation take action against Gary Lineker. To the government ministers who used their platform of the dispatch box in the House of Commons this week to call out and criticise what he said. If you are an elected politician and you think it is your place to pressure the independent state broadcaster into forcing a senior presenter to apologise for criticising your policy, that is not how an elected politician in a liberal democracy should behave. Don't, on the one hand, warble on about the importance of a free press, and then when a member of that free press says something you don't like, sign a letter demanding that they apologise or are sacked. It makes a complete mockery of anything else you have to say about the free press. And it's the sort of behaviour we expect from politicians in Russia or Cuba or Iran, not the UK. It's not your place. So yes, we can have a debate about what Gary Lineker said, but it is absolutely, resolutely not the job of government ministers to use their platforms and their influence to slag off senior presenters at the public service broadcast. It's totally inappropriate, and it's a very, very slippery slope in my view. So fine, Rishi Sunak might put out a statement last night saying Gary Lineker's role is an issue for the BBC. Fine. But it's pretty hollow, isn't it, when his ministers have spent the entire week vocally using their platform to pile pressure on the BBC to do something about Gary Lineker. They didn't see it as just a job for the BBC. And my worry is that those in power are increasingly using their power to try to pressure people in the media into doing what they want or don't want. There's the threats about the licence fee. Look at how certain journalists were banned from briefings under Boris Johnson's government. Look at how the same government boycotted certain shows or stations when they didn't ask questions that they liked or in a way that they liked. Count how often a journalist who asked a particularly difficult question at a government press conference wasn't offered another question for weeks or months. And the letter from Tory MPs and statements from ministers this week is the latest example of politicians and people in power, I think, trying to unduly influence those in the media. And that should worry us all. So yes, criticise the BBC for caving in to that pressure. But let's not let off the hook people who are using that platform that we've given them as elected officials to pile that pressure on in the first place. That's my view on this. 36 Tory MPs, by the way, not 26, who have signed that letter, Tory MPs and peers. Lots more calls to come on this. 0345 6060 973. Let me know where you are and what you've made of the events of the last week.